There are moments in life when all the sounds outside seem to continue as usual, yet inside, everything sinks into a silence that is difficult to name. It is not peace, but a kind of emptiness, a feeling of existing, yet not truly living. A person still walks, still works, still speaks and smiles, but deep within, something is cracked. It is not always a clear pain. Sometimes it is simply a lingering exhaustion, a sense of being lost, or a quiet anxiety without any specific cause. And the strange thing is, the more one tries to run from it, the more tightly it clings. Most people are taught how to change their circumstances, but rarely are they taught how to look deeply into their own minds. When suffering appears, the natural reaction is to try to eliminate it. People turn to busyness to forget the emptiness. They seek short-term pleasures to cover invisible wounds. They chase recognition, success, or control, hoping that once something is achieved externally, inner peace will naturally follow. Yet after all those efforts, there are still long nights when the mind cannot rest. There are still repetitive thoughts, uninvited worries, and a sense that no matter how far one has gone, true peace has not yet been touched. This does not happen because people are weak. It happens because most people have never truly been guided to recognize themselves. The mind functions as a continuous stream of thoughts, memories, emotions, and reactions. But instead of observing that stream, people are often swept away by it. When a negative thought appears, it is no longer just a thought. It becomes reality. When a painful emotion arises, it is no longer just a passing feeling. It becomes an identity. Gradually, people begin to believe that they are their thoughts, their fears, their wounds. It is here that the absence of awareness becomes the deep root of suffering, not because suffering itself holds absolute power, but because it is not seen clearly. What is unseen will control a person from the shadows. Unconscious thoughts shape actions, unconscious fears shape decisions, and unconscious wounds shape the way a person sees the world, others, and themselves. A person can live an entire lifetime driven by old patterns without ever realizing that another choice exists. Awareness, in its deepest essence, is not a philosophical idea. It is an awakening, not an awakening from the body's sleep, but from the sleep of unconsciousness. It is the moment when a person begins to see their thoughts without merging with them, when one realizes that emotions come and go, yet there is a part within that always remains, quietly observing. That part is not wounded by the past, nor threatened by the future. It simply is. When awareness begins to arise, a subtle yet profound shift takes place. Thoughts that once felt overpowering began to lose their authority, not because they immediately disappear, but because they are no longer blindly believed. A fear, when clearly seen, is no longer an invisible monster. It is simply a reaction of the mind. A painful memory, when seen with awareness, is no longer a bleeding wound. It is only a trace of what has passed. Most psychological suffering does not come from the event itself, but from identification with what happened. When something painful occurs, the mind does not simply register it. It tells a story about it. It repeats that story. It builds an identity around that story. Over time, the story becomes stronger than the original reality. But awareness has the capacity to break this cycle, not by fighting the thought, but by shining light upon it. And when the light of awareness appears, what once seemed solid begins to dissolve. It is important to understand that true healing does not come from becoming a new version of oneself. It comes from seeing the current version clearly without denial, without avoidance, and without judgment. Awareness does not force change. It creates space for change to happen naturally. Like when a dark room is opened to the light, the darkness does not need to be pushed out. It simply disappears. People often search for peace as a distant goal, as if it were a state that can only be reached after every problem has been solved. But peace is not at the end of the road. It is present in the very moment one stops resisting their own experience, when there is no longer an effort to become someone else, no longer an attempt to escape what is. A natural stillness begins to emerge, and within that stillness lies a profound healing power. Awareness does not remove life's challenges, but it changes the way they are experienced. It transforms moments of suffering into moments of understanding. It turns unconscious reactions into conscious choices, and most importantly, it returns to a person something they never truly lost, but forgot how to touch: the inherent peace within. The journey of healing does not begin when circumstances change. It begins when awareness arises, not as a tense effort, but as a return to oneself, not through the lens of the past, not through the worrying of the future, but through the pure presence of this moment. And within that presence, a person begins to realize that what they have always been searching for was never outside. It has always been here, waiting to be seen. When awareness begins to be present, the first thing a person discovers is not immediate peace, but the truth about how the mind has been operating for a long time without being noticed. The mind never truly stops. It continuously interprets, compares, recalls, and predicts. It pulls a person back into the past with memories that have already passed, or pushes them into the future with worries that have not yet happened. And in that process, the present moment, the only moment in which life is truly unfolding, is often forgotten. Most psychological wounds do not exist as events that are currently happening, but as imprints stored in the mind. A sentence spoken many years ago can still cause pain, not because it is still being spoken, but because the mind is still repeating it. A past failure can still create fear, not because it is still occurring, but because the mind is still identifying itself with it. And without awareness, a person does not realize that they are not living in reality, but living in reflections of the past and projections of the future. Awareness brings a subtle yet powerful separation. It allows a person to see thoughts as thoughts, rather than taking them as absolute truth. When a thought arises that says, "I am not good enough," awareness does not try to erase that thought, nor does it attempt to replace it with a more positive one. It simply sees, this is a thought, not the essence of who I am. And in that moment, a space is created, a space between the observer and what is being observed. This space is the beginning of inner freedom. Before awareness, a person lives as if dissolved into the flow of the mind. Each thought triggers an emotion. Each emotion triggers a reaction, and each reaction reinforces old patterns. This is the loop of unconsciousness. But when awareness appears, this loop begins to weaken, not because a person tries to break it through willpower, but because the light of awareness makes unconscious patterns unable to hide. What is clearly seen can no longer control a person in the old way. One of the most profound discoveries that awareness brings is that a person is not their mind. The mind is a tool, a process, but it is not the core essence. There is a part within that is always present, always still, always observing. That part is not wounded by what has happened, and is not limited by what the mind believes. When a person begins to recognize this part, a deep transformation begins to unfold. They no longer feel trapped within their own experience. They begin to sense an inner space, a space in which all thoughts and emotions can come and go without leaving a permanent mark. True healing does not occur when all negative thoughts disappear. It occurs when those thoughts no longer have the power to define a person. Sadness may still arise, but it no longer consumes the entire field of awareness. Fear may still be present, but it no longer controls every decision. Awareness does not remove the human experience. It brings freedom within that experience. This also changes the way a person faces themselves. Instead of resisting the parts they dislike, they begin to observe them with openness. Instead of trying to become an ideal version of themselves, they begin to understand the present version, and within that understanding, a gentleness emerges. There is no longer force, no longer harsh judgment, but a deep acceptance, not a passive acceptance, but a transformative one. Because when something is clearly seen, it begins to change naturally. Awareness also brings a person back to the living reality of life. Things that were once overlooked begin to become clear. A breath is no longer taken for granted, but becomes a vivid experience. A moment of silence is no longer an empty gap, but becomes a space of presence. A person begins to live less in thought and more in direct reality, and in that reality, there is a peace that does not depend on circumstances. Most anxiety comes from the mind constantly searching for somewhere other than where a person is standing. It believes that peace lies in the future, after everything has been resolved. But awareness shows that peace is not the result of controlling life. It is the result of being fully present with life as it is. When there is no longer inner resistance, a natural stillness begins to arise, and within that stillness the mind gradually loses its dominance. Over time, awareness is no longer a practice, but becomes a natural state. A person does not need to try to be conscious. They simply are conscious. They do not need to force themselves to be peaceful. They simply are no longer pulled away from the inherent peace within. And in that state, healing is no longer a distant goal. It becomes an ongoing process. Moment by moment, within the silent presence of awareness, there is a truth that people often realize only after many years of searching. What they have always tried to attain was never truly ahead of them. It is not found in a perfect circumstance, not in becoming an ideal version of themselves, and not in completely eliminating every negative thought. What they seek healing, peace, and a sense of wholeness has always quietly existed behind every experience, but it only becomes clear when awareness appears. Awareness is not something that needs to be created, because it has never truly been absent. It is always there, like the sky that remains present behind the clouds. Thoughts, emotions, fears, and memories are like clouds drifting by. Sometimes they are dense, sometimes they are dark, and sometimes they seem to cover the entire sky. But the sky has never been harmed by them. In the same way, the deepest essence of a person has never been broken by what has happened. Only identification with the clouds makes a person forget the vast sky they truly are. When awareness becomes part of daily life, a profound yet gentle shift begins to unfold. A person no longer reacts unconsciously to every thought that appears. They no longer believe every story the mind tells. They begin to see that thoughts are only temporary movements. Emotions are only waves that come and go. And when there is no longer attachment to them, a new kind of freedom emerges. Not freedom from life, but freedom within life itself. True peace is not the absence of noise, but the absence of identification. The noise of the world may still continue, challenges may still arise, difficult moments may still come, but inside, something is no longer disturbed as before. There is a stillness that does not depend on circumstances. There is a steadiness that does not depend on outcomes. And from that stillness, a person begins to live more fully, no longer imprisoned by the past, nor haunted by the future. The miracle is that healing does not occur as a grand event. It happens in very small moments. In the moment when a person realizes they are not their thoughts, in the moment when they observe an emotion without trying to change it, in the moment when they simply remain present without trying to become anyone else. Those moments may seem fragile, yet they are restructuring the entire inner experience. Over time, a person begins to feel life in a different way, no longer as a series of problems to be solved, but as a flow to be experienced. No longer as a continuous struggle, but as a process unfolding. And in that process, they began to realize that they were never truly lost. They had simply forgotten how to return to themselves. Awareness does not bring a life without challenges, but it brings a mind that is no longer trapped within those challenges. It does not immediately change the outer world, but it changes the way the world is experienced. And when the way of experiencing changes, the entire quality of life changes with it. What once caused deep suffering begins to lose its weight. What once felt empty begins to feel alive. And what was once searched for everywhere begins to be recognized within this very presence. Perhaps this journey has no clear ending, because awareness is not a destination, it is a way of living in which a person is no longer lost in the stories of the mind, but begins to live in the direct truth of each moment. And within that way of living, healing is no longer something distant. It becomes the natural foundation of existence. If these words touch something within you, take a moment not only to understand them with thought, but to feel them through your own presence right now. Because truth does not lie in words, but in your direct realization. And if you wish to continue exploring more deeply the depths of awareness, inner healing, and the path toward lasting peace, write down your feelings or experiences in the comments section. Each sharing is not only a story, but can also become a light that helps others recognize themselves. And subscribe to the channel to continue walking together on the journey of returning to stillness, wisdom, and the freedom that has always been present within. Because sometimes a single moment of realization can allow an entire life to begin changing from the deepest place within.